Welcome to the Economic Rockstar Podcast with your host, Frank Conway, connecting brilliant minds in economics and finance.
Hello all you Economic Rockstar listeners, welcome back to another episode, and in this week's episode number 144, I speak with Professor Donald Boudreaux. Donald Boudreaux is an American economist, author, professor and co-director of the program on the American Economy and Globalization at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. He is the author of the 2007 and 2012 books Globalisation and Hypocrites and Half-Wits, and is also a daily contributor to the Cafe Hayek blog, in which he writes with Russ Roberts, who also previously featured in this podcast. Professor Boudreaux has lectured in the United States, Canada, Latin America and Europe, and is well published in a number of scholarly journals, as well as having his writing published in the Wall Street Journal, Investors Business Daily, Reason and the Cato Journal. I'm really excited to share this episode with you. We decided to go with the theme of international trade, something that is very much in the news right now, where we actually discuss what comparative advantage is, whether it is good to impose tariffs and adopt a protectionist policy. Professor Boudreaux also addresses some of my questions, in which I ask him if globalization facilitates material prosperity, whether it's actually good for us, will protectionism actually bring back US jobs, and will there be a trade-off to that? And what are their main reasons for trade? And does it promote diplomacy and reduces military intervention? This episode is not only a conversation on international trade, but it is packed full of educational themes that those who have studied Econ 101 would be quite familiar with. We had planned to leave room for a discussion on Friedrich Hayek, so we're going to meet up sometime shortly and release another episode solely for Friedrich Hayek. And while preparing for this introduction, I didn't realise it, but Professor Boudreaux also has another book called The Essential Hayek, and that rang a bell because I had downloaded that for free on Kindle a number of years ago. So for those of you who have never come across Friedrich Hayek, would like to read up on him, prior to our episode, which will be coming shortly, check out the Kindle app, download it onto your phone if you haven't got it already, and check out The Essential Hayek. And you can check out Professor Boudreaux at cafehayek.com. I'll also have a link to his website, as well as all the resources, books and readings mentioned by myself and Donald at economicrockstar.com/Donald Boudreaux. That's Boudreaux. Or you can go to economicrockstar.com/podcasts. Find a list of all episodes that have been released to date. If this is your first time listening to the podcast, make sure to subscribe on your favourite podcast platform. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure you subscribe to never miss an episode. And also please leave an honest rating and review. And if there's any episode in the catalogue on economicrockstar.com/podcasts that you like, or that you think someone that you know would like, and I'm sure there's something for everyone there at this stage, why not copy the URL and text or email that person? There are episodes on sports economics, popular culture, superheroes, stock markets, terrorism, and I have a number of Nobel laureates who have featured also. And if you feel that you'd like to help the podcast a bit more, why not check out patreon.com/economicrockstar. Check out some of the tiers or the levels there, see which one suits you. And there are some rewards in which I can pay back in some way or another, such as giving you a shout out on a podcast episode or placing you on a supporters page on the website. If you would like to feature on the podcast yourself, or if you know somebody who will be a great fit for this podcast, why not get in touch with me on economicrockstar@gmail.com, or join the Economic Rockstar community by visiting the website and sign up for any future updates. And once again, thank you so much for taking time out to spend time listening to my podcast. I really appreciate it, and have a great day. Enjoy this episode with Professor Donald Boudreaux.
Economic change is an indispensable part of a modern growing industrial society. If you try to stop the economy from changing, you're going to kill it. And so change is incessant, and it's part of that. It's inseparable from that economy. And international trade is only one of the many mechanisms that cause change and transmit change. Many other mechanisms exist, and there's no reason that I can see for singling international trade out, other than the fact that it's far easier to demonize foreigners than it is to demonize fellow citizens. The number of workers in the steel producing and aluminum producing industries together, combined, in the United States today is about 170,000. The number of workers in industries in the U.S. where steel or aluminum, the kind of steel and aluminum subject to the tariffs, where those kinds of metals are a primary input into the production, those numbers of workers number about 6.5 million. And so the steel aluminum tariffs that Trump imposes help roughly 170,000 workers at the expense of jeopardizing the livelihoods of 6.5 million workers.
So do you just know from your own history, is it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I knew all my grandparents and culturally, the Irish and both sides of my family were dominant. So St. Patrick's Day was always a big deal. And
yeah.
So.
I'm
from New Orleans. There's actually a large Irish community in New Orleans.
Okay. I didn't realize that there was that Irish community there at all, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's where the flooding and all happened, was it?
From Hurricane Katrina, 13 years ago, yeah.
I know there was a lot on the news about that, but I never heard of any Irish involvement or groups that might have helped out. I'm sure people...
Well, so if not that you would have, but the area of the city that was hit the hardest was called the Irish Channel.
Wow.
Yeah. So the place called the Lower Ninth Ward in the Irish Channel. And both of them were pretty much all flooded out completely. But the Irish Channel refers to that part of New Orleans where in the the mid 19th century, a lot of my ancestors and a lot of other Irish came to the city.
It's nice to always go back to your history like that, isn't it? Because recently I did a 23andMe saliva test and I got the results back about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And it says I'm 96 point something % Irish British. So it's not like, what was the point getting that done, eh?
Well, at least you know there's no surprises, right?
Yeah, that's it. Even though, like, when you have international students coming over to Ireland,
yeah, I
know some of them ask me, especially continental Europeans like Italians, they have this stereotype, I think, of Irish, and they just, are you Italian or the black hair? You know, it's just the black hair, or Spanish or something like that. And then I kind of tan easily during the summer as well. And then I'm there thinking, I wonder, is there that kind of link going back? Although it did say 5 generations of, there was German and French history there as well, you know. And then there was a little bit of something like a 0.9 of Finnish. And then it showed me the X chromosome, and I have to question this because the upper part of that X chromosome on the top right, it's dominated by Scandinavian. So I don't know. I need to find out, see what that's about, you know.
Northern Europe's a fairly small community, and
Vikings then as well.
Yeah. You don't have the red hair and the blue
fiery eyes. Yes. That's it. And burn easily during the summer.
Yeah.
I really appreciate you coming on, Donald. Do I refer to you as Donald or Don during this conversation?
Don is what people call me, yeah.
A listener has actually got in touch with me recently regarding potential guests that I could ask to come onto the show. And I am personally aware of Cafe Hayek. I used to read your blog back, I suppose, when it first started, really. And I didn't realize that it was connected to yourself. I knew Russ Roberts was there because maybe I had listened to Russ Roberts as well on his podcast. But Nathaniel Smith got in touch with me asking me specifically to talk about international trade and mentioned your name as the person to go to. And obviously, you know, I'm always interested in reaching out to people. And knowing then that you have this fantastic website, a book that criticizes any aspect of or any political leaning if you feel that it's kind of hypocritical, or you do have that unbiased approach, even though people might say, oh, well, you're libertarian and you're on the Hayek side, or you're from the Mercatus Center, or you lecture in GMU. Yeah. If it's okay, I'd love to talk to you about your work.
Yeah. I mean, trade is to the extent that I have a specialty, it's international trade. And, you know, as you know, trade is now, it's always in the news, but, you know, in the last several years, it's been especially much in the news. And indeed, to this very day, you know, President of the United States keeps flip-flopping on trade and saying the most absurd things about it. So I'm happy to talk about trade, Hayek, whatever you like.
Yeah, perfect. I'd love to explore Hayek as well. And coincidentally, about an hour before I spoke to you, just flicked on the news and on Sky News, on CNBC and Bloomberg. It's all about Donald Trump's tariffs on the EU and Canada. The Canadians aren't happy and there's going to be that retaliation, and it's like protectionism. And these are all the basic themes that are foundation really to a discussion on international trade, I'm sure. And also I was speaking to a former student of mine who now lectures in University College Cork, and where I did my master's, and I turned around on a shelf. He's an external examiner for a couple of papers, and I turned around on my shelf and there was a folder there of a colloquium that we used to do at the time, and it was all about Hayek. So two of those particular themes that we are more than likely going to discuss today.
Okay, yeah, let's do it.
I suppose students from a university, say studying trade, if you don't mind going to that level first,
of course, yeah,
would be introduced to the Ricardian model and also looking at comparative and absolute advantage, a nice diagram on the production possibility frontier, and how each country, if they lived in an autarky state or produced in autarky, and it showed it before and after once they actually trade, and you see the benefits from that diagram, which is pretty much one-dimensional, and assumptions are built around a two-good and a two-country economy or world economy. But still, we get an idea that trade benefits. So I suppose if you could talk to me about, if you don't mind, this production possibility frontier, and does it actually make sense in reality? And do the ideas of Ricardo or even Heckscher-Ohlin work?
Yeah. So first on the production possibilities frontier, or curve, as it's sometimes called. And it's an analytical tool, as you know. It's an analytical tool, and I think it helps to convey as a picture of one important aspect of reality. If you want more guns, you have to give up butter. If you want more butter, you have to give up guns. And you can show economic growth by showing the production possibilities curve moving outward. So like all analytical tools, depending upon the knowledge and wisdom of the person using it, it can be helpful or it can be misleading. If people take it too literally, it becomes a damaging device rather than a tool to further understanding. I've always I've always wished that Ricardo had introduced comparative advantage, not in the context in which he did. And of course, he introduced it in chapter 7 of his 1817 Principles book, in the chapter entitled on foreign trade. And the two trading entities he had, of course, were England and Portugal, and two goods being cloth and wine. And when I teach comparative advantage, which I do very early on in my freshman economics classes, I always have the trading partners being individuals, persons, flesh and blood people, because it's not really countries that have comparative advantages; it's people who have comparative. And
I never thought of it that way. Sorry, Donald, for cutting across, but that's really useful to think that way. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so, because we can, and I tell my students this: we can say that England has a comparative advantage of producing cloth and Portugal has a comparative advantage of producing wine, if we understand that what we really mean by that, or that the flesh and blood people in England have a comparative advantage of producing cloth over wine compared to the flesh and blood people in Portugal. It's the people that have the comparative advantage. And so that's one thought I'd like to put out there. A second thought is, and I used to say this myself, but I think it's mistaken now. I used to say that, Ricardo's principle of comparative advantage is the foundation on which, economists base their case for free international trade. It's not completely wrong, but I think that formulation does a disservice to Adam Smith. Of course, Adam Smith didn't have comparative advantage in The Wealth of Nations, but he begins The Wealth of Nations with a story of the division of labor, specialization. Yeah. And so in Smith's case, specialization, even if no parties start off with a comparative advantage, they can still gain by specializing, because the specialists They save time moving from task to task. They become more skilled. They're more likely to invent machinery to do these tasks. And so I think it's really a combination of Smith and Ricardo. I get this last idea, by the way, from my late colleague Jim Buchanan, the Nobel Prize winner. I think he's right to say that Smith gets short shrift when economists talk about international trade. Ricardo's important, but Smith is also important as well. And yeah, so those are my initial thoughts on comparative advantage and its role in helping us to understand not just why nations trade, but why people trade. And sometimes that trade happens to be across political borders. Many times it's not. When I trade with someone elsewhere in Virginia or in New York, I'm trading with fellow Americans. Yeah. But that's explained by the very same principles that Adam Smith and David Ricardo identified. There's nothing fundamentally different if I start trading with someone in Toronto or in Dublin or in Berlin. It's the same principles. And the idea of political borders being some mystical or creating some mystical difference that separates international from intranational domestic trade is, I think it's one of the great contributions that economists have made to human understanding over the past 250 years, that the instinct that a lot of people have that international borders have some economic significance is really false.
For those people who might be a little lost with our conversation at the moment, could you clarify what comparative advantage is?
Yes, but with a preface. Comparative advantage is famous among economists for being one of the few really fundamental and true insights of economics that's also very counterintuitive. It's not easy to explain verbally. We always use, arithmetical or diagrammatic means of conveying it. But what it boils down to is this, and that is a person's efficiency, to use that term, a person's relative efficiency at doing some task. It should never be measured in any absolutes. It only matters how well or poorly you do something is well or poor only compared to someone else. And so if I can produce a pair of blue jeans in 2 hours, and just knowing that, you don't know if I'm good or bad at producing blue jeans. And it's actually a meaningless statement. You have to compare me to someone. And so if you can produce a pair of blue jeans it's the same quality pair in 3 hours, then compared to you, I am better at producing blue jeans. And if you are comparatively better at me at producing shoes, then if I specialize in producing blue jeans, we as a group, you and I, we get more blue jeans in some given amount of time than we would if you spent time producing blue jeans. We get more shoes if you specialize in producing shoes. And so our little economic group, this little two-person society, has more jeans and more shoes when each of us specializes according to our comparative advantage. And so the size of the economic pie is made larger by specialization according to comparative advantage, which means that on average, each of us have a bigger piece of pie.
Does that tie in with the efficiency of labor as well? Because you refer to efficiency. Ricardo doesn't necessarily talk about quality, does he? Because you could have blue jeans that you can make in 2 hours. I could make blue jeans in 3 hours, but I could have a better quality that could be last longer.
Yeah, so those are some of the assumptions that are just held. Some of the assumptions are that the goods that we're talking about, the quality is held constant. Changing those assumptions does nothing to challenge the fundamental premise of the model. Obviously, we want to compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges, which means we want to compare the same kinds of goods to each other. I don't recall that Ricardo said anything about quality, certainly not in the chapter on foreign trade, but it wouldn't in any way diminish the thrust of or the importance of the theory.
And hence we have these real life examples being played out at the moment. One example would be the Mexican border with the US, the Maquiladora area, whereby it's heavily populated by US industry, like say Philips, who do the manufacturing there and bring the products back or export the products back into the US. And also the likes of China being able to produce goods at a comparatively better,
lower cost,
and more efficient. So the question is now, how does international, like this was obviously good, say, if you compare US with the using those two countries or those two people, if you want to go back to your example, a US individual, a Chinese individual, Chinese are producing better, the Chinese should produce those goods and let the US person produce something else or increase their leisure time, if you want to head down that way.
Yeah, so what trade allows us to do when we specialize according to comparative advantage, I like to explain this way. Trade allows us, each of us, to tap into the other person's special talents, the other person's comparative advantage. If you have a comparative advantage of producing shoes and I don't, which means if you can produce shoes at a lower cost, which means if you can produce shoes by giving up fewer other things than I give up were I to produce shoes, right? Then if I specialize in producing what I have a comparative advantage in and we trade, then I'm able to get shoes from you at a lower cost than it would cost me to make them myself. You're able to get jeans from me at a lower cost than it would cost you to make those jeans for yourself. And so even though each of us profit by this trade, we also help the other person profit from this trade. So when I trade with you, I'm tapping in to your lower cost of producing shoes, and you are simultaneously tapping into my lower cost of producing jeans. And that's what trade does. And for people who doubt this, it sounds very theoretical and, so, well, why should you believe these two guys talking now? You just look at the world around you. If you are in the modern world, just look at the world you live in. I don't care if you're in the United States, in Ireland, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, even. We all are surrounded by access to goods and services that none of us could conceivably make on our own. You and I are talking now using a computer. We're talking in real time. There's a vast ocean that separates us. Both of our homes are artificially lit. Both of our homes have in them indoor plumbing. We're both wearing clothing. I don't know about you. I have vision correction in my eyes. I have a cell phone sitting close by. I take medicine for blood pressure. I don't make any of this stuff, and I couldn't begin to make any of this stuff. So the world we live in is testament to the power of specialization and trade. So it isn't as if these theories are sort of wild speculations where the theorist is looking to find an application. These theories explain this amazingly, stupendously rich society that we are part of.
I just recently read something, I think it was yesterday, it might have been Keynes' essay to his grandchildren. I think he wrote in 1930 about, I think it was Keynes, over how the UK is where it is right now based on their decision to first trade 250 years ago. I think they stole gold or something like that from the Portuguese. Yeah. I think it was about investments.
I don't know the essay. So one of the many, there are a lot, myths that people have about trade is that it's about money. And so if the English, or if the Spanish got more money, more gold, which serves as money, then the English and the Spanish are somehow winning that trade. And one of the great insights of Adam Smith is that the wealth of a nation is not found in the quantity of precious metals or money that it has in its borders. It's found in the access that its people, ordinary people, have to goods and services that they can consume. The very title of Adam Smith's book is an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. And the nature of wealth for Adam Smith, and I'm quite sure he chose that title intentionally, was to point out that it is although widespread, it's a myth to think that trade should be about getting money. Right? Money is not what makes you rich. Money is it's an important institution. It's an institution that we use to buy things. We want money because of what we can use it to acquire. We don't want money because we can consume it as money. We use it to acquire things. And it's the access to those things, those real goods and services, that make us rich.
When Hector Olin talks about factor endowments, the importance of those and bringing it to international trade, are they as important for... Like they probably aren't important unless we identify another country who has those factor endowments, and then we can identify that they have perhaps an absolute advantage in producing goods using those resources. So we concentrate on our own, for example, and money then would be a medium to acquire those goods that another country would produce.
Right. So I've always interpreted Hector Olin to be. This is not a criticism. I think it's a very insightful pieces of work. I would, though, interpret it to be almost a truism, right? That however you define resources, those resources that are relatively abundant in your country, in your region, in your town. When resources are relatively abundant, well, of course, they're relatively less costly to use. Therefore, the things produced with them can be sold at a lower price than if you were producing something that uses less abundant resources. And so it's natural that specialization will occur along the lines of factor endowments, relatively abundant. And I have a relative abundance of toleration for sitting down at a desk all day and reading economics and standing up in front of people and talking about economics. Other people have a relative abundance of the ability to program computers, and so we trade. And so in one sense, I think textual lean is trivial, but it's astonishing how many trivial insights are never thought of until someone comes up with them, and how important keeping them in mind is when we try to understand the world that we live in.
Like, I love your interpretation of Ricardo using individuals rather than companies. Because if a country, say Ireland, who used to be great at weaving, and we had these cottage industries that with the industrial age then, and they disappeared, but we had a specialism. And personally, my family, we are weavers, so we continue in that. We're pretty much the only linen weavers now in Ireland, in the Republic. And we continue that to this day. But a lot of that has been shut down, and other countries can do that perhaps more efficiently at a larger scale, more cost effective. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't mean that we had to do a structural shutdown of that industry in Ireland so that we could concentrate that premises on something else. So we're not coerced to do that. Whereas, say, for example, mining in Wales in the UK, that there was a huge structural change there. So I don't know what the reason for that was. I can't remember what Margaret Thatcher did in that case. Was it due to environmental issues? Was it due to being able to import at a cheaper rate? Yeah. Or just to make a transition into other industries? So it is a good way of explaining that, because the questions could always arise as to why do these industries still operate within a country when we don't have the efficiency or the economies of scale to do it. Yeah,
obviously the real world is a lot more complex than the two-person model. And so if you look at a simple Ricardo, if you take Ricardo too literally, it's one who, in America, in the United States, we both produce cars here, and yet we import cars also from several other countries. Why is that? That seems to contradict the model. And of course, the model properly understood, again, it's not, your point is not that the country has the comparative advantage, is that different individuals have comparative advantages, and the goods also are so in reality, so distinct. I mean, so a person can have a comparative advantage, or a company can have a comparative advantage of producing one variety of automobile, say, pickup trucks, while another company can have a comparative, or country, whether it's in the same country or another country, can have a comparative advantage producing another kind of automobile. So when we just talk in terms of automobiles, that often masks the important complex details beneath the overall label. And let me just say, if you don't mind, one other thing about another advantage I see in using focusing on the fact that specialization occurs at the individual level rather than at the country level, and that is one of the main objection to free trade, of course, is that they see some workers being put out of jobs because of imports in some industries, such as, the textile industry in growing countries, in wealthy countries, being closed down because of imports. And they say, that's a cost of international trade. And I think that's a mistake. I think it's wrong. I think anytime you have economic change, you have some jobs that are destroyed and other jobs that are created. I believe it's vitally important to point out incessantly that there is nothing unique about international trade at destroying particular jobs. Anytime consumers change the way they spend their money, for whatever reason, some jobs are destroyed, other jobs are created. And my favorite go-to example for this over the past several years has been the Atkins diet. And I don't know how it was in Ireland or over on that side of the ocean, but about 18 or 19 years ago, the Atkins diet was all the rage. I mean, everybody was on the Atkins diet, right? No carbohydrates, all protein. And there was a a donut franchise in the United States called Krispy Kreme.
Yeah.
And Krispy Kreme announced that they shut down several of their stores, and they said, we're doing this because of the Atkins diet. And I believe they were correct. I think that, people they lowered their demand for donuts, and, they increased their demand for chicken and pork and beef or bacon. And as a result, Krispy Kreme had to close some of its stores. Some workers lost their jobs. It had nothing to do with international trade. It had everything to do with consumers changing their diets. And I think, again, the point of the example is economic change is an indispensable part of a modern growing industrial society. If you try to stop the economy from changing, you're going to kill it. And so change is incessant, and it's part of that. It's inseparable from that economy. And international trade is only one of the many mechanisms that cause change and transmit change. Many other mechanisms exist, and there's no reason that I can see for singling international trade out, other than the fact that it's far easier to demonize foreigners than it is to demonize fellow citizens.
I suppose companies need to, I'm probably taking a cliche here, to adapt or die when there are certain changes due to technological advances or changes to people's behavior, whether it's a fad or whether they're permanent changes. And I have a book here that I was reading coincidentally, and it's not an economics book, but it's called Perennial Seller by Ryan Holiday. I don't know if you've Ryan Holiday. He's an author of Ego is the Enemy and The Obstacle is the Way, and this book is the art of making a marketing work that lasts. So we know economics might have some marketing type themes in there as well, but Perennial Seller is about these companies that have existed for dynasties or for hundreds of years, and prime examples are these Japanese companies who hand the ownership down throughout the ages, and they last for, like, there's whiskey making companies here that are over 600 years old. Yeah. And also, I think I didn't finish the book, but I ended at an example. I think it's the owner. It might be the Wall Street Journal. I don't know, but her husband passed away, and she took over the company, and she had to adapt, and it was Warren Buffett then that invested in the company, and he made an immense amount of money on the turnaround when the board felt that she wasn't the one to run it, and she took she adapted due to whatever changes had to be made, and that wasn't to do with international trade. An industry like that, we know the newspaper industry have to make these adaptations due to the technology and the access to it. As you mentioned earlier, we are connected overseas on a laptop, and we can access on our mobile phones editorial reports, your blog, my website, any newspaper reports, and they have to adapt to it or shut down. Yeah. It's not international trade, really. It is in a way, because we are trading internationally online, but it's an excuse. Yeah,
two things on this matter. One is, there's been this debate in economics. It's a little bit settled now, but over the past 20 or so years, there's debate in economics about whether the world today is as globalized as it was on the eve of World War I. And there are various measures of globalization, the percent of imports and exports together as a percent of GDP, for example. But I think now there's no question that the world is more globalized than it was at any time in history. It is true that the extent of globalization decreased during the middle part of the 20th century. But now we're at a level of globalization that is completely unprecedented. The supply chains now are so globally integrated. There's virtually nothing, or very little, relatively little, that is produced in a country. Yeah. So I like a phrase that the trade analyst at the Cato Institute, Dan Ikinson, came up with. He calls it made on earth. So we see all these made in labels, made in Ireland, made in the USA, made in China. And most of them are misleading. What those labels really mean today, to the extent that they're accurate at all, is if they were accurate, they would read final assembly occurred in, USA, Ireland, China. Because when the Chinese produce, a cell phone, they assemble the cell phone. They're doing it, the idea that made the cell phone came from Cupertino, California. The elements in this thing are, I forget now the details, but it's got ingredients in it from all over the world that were delivered to China, and it were finally assembled there, and then the thing shipped around the world, in my case to the US. And so to say it's made in China is highly misleading. It's made on earth. And that's true for almost anything we consume. You might take exception to, certain agricultural products. Corn is grown in Iowa. But even on that, I like to point out, because the French really don't like this. I mean, they're so chauvinistic. The great vineyards of Bordeaux, where all the first growth Bordeaux wines come from. A lot of those vineyards are the rootstock came 150 years ago from, of all places, Missouri.
No way.
Yeah. I forget the name of the disease offhand, but there was a disease that ravaged the French, I think it was just Bordeaux, but ravaged a lot of the Bordeaux rootstock. And someone realized that there was a grape native or a rootstock native to Missouri, or at least found in Missouri, that was resistant to this disease. And, with a little bit of genetic engineering, they brought that rootstock literally from Missouri over to Bordeaux. And so today, when you drink, I don't know, perhaps a Chateau Latour or a Chateau Lafite Rothschild, it's grown in Bordeaux and the grapes are picked in Bordeaux, but my gosh, the rootstock likely came from Missouri. So.
And how satisfying is that for someone from Missouri to be aware of that and drink that and just finish off that last drop of wine with that satisfaction to know that it's coming from, it has its historical roots or ancestry
it
with
literally
Missouri.
has its roots in Missouri. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, it does actually. Yeah.
Example of a little bit of a quirky one, but that's an example of this larger serious point that the global supply chains now are so intricate, so interconnected that it's almost daily becomes more and more misleading to think of where something is made as opposed to just where something is finally assembled. And
I like that, made on Earth.
Made on Earth. Well, I did a number of years ago. I did a video for the Reason Foundation, and I forget now the details, but it was comparing a Jeep Cherokee, which was assembled somewhere in the United States, to a Toyota Camry, which was assembled somewhere in Japan. And if you look at the components of the Jeep Cherokee and the components of the Toyota Camry, what you discover is that a larger portion of the Toyota Camry, value-wise, originally came from the United States than the Jeep Cherokee. Yet the Jeep Cherokee is, that's an American car, and the Toyota Camry is a Japanese import to America. And it just shows how silly it is to do these labels now. They just don't mean anything any longer. But people think they do, and that's misleading.
You wrote a book called Globalisation.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the first chapters on that is a question. I'd like to ask you that particular question on the truth about globalization, the material prosperity that's involved there and what's actually at stake. Does globalization facilitate this material prosperity? And is there a race to the bottom? Is this a way of humans being able to enjoy the fruits of their labor and we are now entitled to have this extra leisure time? I don't know if this is actually addressed in that particular chapter. Is globalization good for us? And if we continue with this, where are we actually heading?
I think unquestionably it's good for us. I think the prosperity that we enjoy today in the modern world is, certain the examples I've just given are relevant. The prosperity we enjoy in the modern world would not be at its level without globalization. And look, in a country as large as, for example, the United States, it's a giant, a transoceanic country, large population. If there was no globalization, if the United States were cut off from the rest of the world, it's probably the case that we 325 million Americans would continue to live maybe at a reasonably high standard of living. It would be a lot lower than our standard of living now, but it would be very difficult to see how the Dutch could live, could survive. And so the smaller the country, the more important globalization is. But it's important for everyone. It might appear to be an overly simplistic way of answering or addressing your question, but if I, as an American, choose to buy something that is made in Korea or in Mexico, as opposed to buying its substitute, which is made in Kansas or California, then I must regard that product from Mexico to be the superior product. I'm getting more for my money. When I get more for my money, I have more money left over to buy other things. And so if you prevent me from buying that thing from Mexico, maybe in that one instance, you couldn't see any material change in my standard of living. But if you prevent me from buying all the other things, it's more likely you're going to see my material standard of living falling. And then if you prevent every one of us in America from buying all the things that we choose to buy from abroad, the reduction in the standard of living will be significant. And of course, I use myself as an American example, but what's true for me is true for everybody. If you choose to spend your money buying something from Germany or buying something from South Africa, it's because you regard that to be the better deal. And if you're prevented from spending your money in that way, you'll be made poorer.
I recall back in the early 90s, Ireland followed this type of campaign they followed a campaign where we should consider buying Irish. So it was like buy Irish, guaranteed Irish. And I think it was we were in a recessionary period. We were getting funding from the EU and then we headed into the boom, So this buying Irish, we kind of adopted it at home and I hated this Irish toothpaste. There was one product we had and it was, I don't know if it's still around and I hope I get away with saying it, but it was called Fiacla, which is the Irish for teeth. So I used a brush with Fiacla and the taste was rotten. It was very grainy and I've brushed my teeth for a number of years with it until I started to get pocket money enough to buy my own toothpaste, which I preferred was, and this is not an endorsement, Colgate. And I honestly think that Fiacla, and this is ridiculous to say, that was perhaps responsible for a couple of fillings that I had to take. Because maybe I resisted brushing my teeth to get the taste or just didn't clean it properly, or maybe I just was lazy. There's only one example. Okay, there's other things that Ireland does make, which is great, but only for globalization, maybe I have these white teeth.
I'm sure it's true in Ireland, I'm sure it's true in every country. I mean, every country has its nationalism. Here in the U.S., buy American, made in USA is good. You feel better if you buy American. And I'm not opposed to people using those kinds of appeals as long as they do so peacefully. I don't like being forced. If you want to tell me to buy American, I would disagree with that. I'm going to buy what I find to be the best deal. I don't particularly care where it's made because I understand economics and I understand that when I buy something from a foreign seller, I'm not hurting Americans as a whole. But I lost my train of thought. I had a brilliant point to make and I've forgotten it.
Sure, if you'd remember, just revisit it and just interrupt me and jump in there again.
Okay.
But when Trump went on his presidential campaign and he visited states like Detroit, which highlighted once very active community in terms of manufacturing, say car manufacturing, there is black and white evidence to suggest, we could spin a narrative here, but there's evidence there to suggest that globalization was a detriment to that particular community. And hence now we have to bring jobs back. That was the rallying cry.
Yes.
And now this was probably leading to protectionism, the tariffs on aluminum and steel, and trying to perhaps bring the industry back and promise these people who voted for Donald Trump to be president to be back in. Is this a false narrative or is there some truth in that?
No, well, all narratives always have some kernel of truth, but oftentimes the kernel of truth is more misleading than an outright falsehood would be. So let me say a couple of things about that. First of all, I'm glad you brought up one of the great ironies in this is that the steel and aluminum tariffs, of course, do nothing to help Detroit. The steel and aluminum tariffs make the cost of producing automobiles in the U.S. rise and doesn't cause them to fall. The steel and aluminum tariffs will help certain steel producers in Pittsburgh and aluminum producers in California and wherever else they are. But the number I happen to know these data pretty well, the number of workers in the steel producing and aluminum producing industries together, combined, in the United States today is about 170,000. The number of workers in industries in the U.S. where steel or aluminum, the kind of steel and aluminum subject to the tariffs, where those kinds of metals are a primary input into the production, those numbers of workers number about 6.5 million. And so the steel and aluminum tariffs that Trump imposes help roughly 170,000 workers at the expense of jeopardizing the livelihoods of 6.5 million workers. This is, just on a pure cost-benefit basis, that seems to be a poor deal.
Not a good trade-off.
It's a bad trade-off. About the I mean, look. It's no secret why the steel and aluminum producers get the tariffs. They are politically very concentrated and very powerful, and so that's why they get a lot of political attention, or favors from politicians. About the point you make about Detroit, that's a little bit more difficult to address, but I think it can be and it should be addressed. It's an appropriate point to raise. So first of all, the case for free trade is not that it helps always particular regions. It could be that a particular region of a country is permanently reduced in population and in prosperity. If trade makes a particular kind of mineral that's mined no longer economically efficient to mine, well, those mining towns will no longer exist. Not as mining towns. But in the case of Detroit and a lot of the so-called Rust Belt in the United States, it is true that we Americans have imported over the years more and more goods and inputs that workers in those places used to produce. But trade is not the only thing that occurred. In principle, there's no reason why those regions and the workers in those regions could not have adapted to changing economies in the same way that their fathers and grandfathers and previous generations adapted to. Pittsburgh was not always a steel producing town. It produced other things, and then steel came along and it changed to producing steel. There were other things that occurred. In my view, government prohibitions or government taxes on the creation of new businesses, any kind of obstacles that make it less attractive for entrepreneurs to start new firms, make it less attractive for workers to pursue new occupations. Occupational licensing restrictions are one of the many things that come to mind. You have a whole array of these changes that took place at the same time when trade was increasing. And it's easy, and I understand it, it's easy to point to trade because it's the single most obvious thing that's happening, single biggest thing, and say, you see, trade increased and now Detroit is losing its population. It must be trade that caused Detroit to suffer. Well, not necessarily. I mean, trade had an effect, but now we have to ask, well, why didn't the citizens of Detroit, why didn't new firms pop up there? Or these workers incapable of working in factories that don't produce? Are they capable of only producing things called automobiles? Can they not produce other things? In a way, it's kind of insulting to the workers. I mean, you only have one thing you can do. And so if you look at more dynamic, if in the United States, if you look at certain regions, they are indeed more stagnant. Detroit is one of them. Although lately Detroit's kind of coming out of its doldrums. But there are regions in the United States that are been more economically stagnant than other regions. And one of the things that separates those, what I'm about to say here will reveal my biases, but we all have our biases. One of the things that separates these two regions, so you look at Texas and Florida and the American South, for all of I'm not saying they're perfect, but tax rates are generally lower. The level of unionization is lower. Level of unionization has been falling for a long time now, but the openness of markets in, say, Texas is higher than it is in some of these Rust Belt towns, or it has been for many decades higher. And so that's why firms move to Texas, and Texas isn't part of the Rust Belt, whereas parts of Ohio and Michigan are parts of the Rust Belt. So trade is not the only thing that goes on, and it's not the only source of change. But I'd like to emphasize once again, when we say trade caused the decline here, we must always keep in mind that it's not trade. Trade is not a thing. Trade is not an entity with a brain. It's your fellow citizens who are choosing to spend their money differently. And when they choose to spend it's their money. They earned it. So if they choose to spend their money in a way that now I remember actually the point that I'd forgotten when they choose to spend their money in the ways that they want, I would say to producers, what right have you to stop other people who've earned their incomes from spending their money as they see fit? They have a right to that income, not you. So this is the point that I wanted to make earlier, that slipped my mind earlier. I'm a great fan of Adam Smith, as you can tell. I keep referring to him. Yeah. One of the other great and important points that Adam Smith made in The Wealth of Nations is precisely that ultimately the justification for economic activity is not the welfare of producers. It's the well-being of consumers. Production, of course, is an important means to our ability to consume more, but the production is justified only by what it produces. If it doesn't produce things that enough people want to buy, then that production is not justified. Resources used in those production enterprises are wasted. And so one of the great merits of the market economy is that when consumers spend their own money, that spending directs entrepreneurs it tells entrepreneurs what consumers want. And sometimes consumers are fickle, and that's fine, but that's the ultimate goal. You can't judge an economy by how well ultimately, you have to judge an economy not by how well it supports its existing producers, but instead by how well it supports its existing population in terms of their standards of living.
I'd love to think of an example based on what you were just saying there, because you were mentioning taxes and the way trade does not make changes to the industry. It's people's choices and their changes in choices. For example, is it California where Tesla have their main factory for production of the cars?
I confess I don't know. I think so, but I wouldn't swear to it.
I think they took over a previous car manufacturing plant there. It might have been Toyota. It could be now. I don't know whether it's or Chrysler. It could be an American-owned company. And that could be an example of changes in technology. And you have an entrepreneur who is willing to make a new car based on the availability of technology today. But some people criticize Tesla because it hasn't turned a profit yet. And perhaps they're putting the money back into the company to grow it and make these supercharger factories, I think they're called, to build the batteries. But they are heavily subsidized in order to produce these environmentally efficient batteries.
Yep.
Are we creating, as an example here, are we creating a type of company or an industry that is not really needed by consumers, and it will eventually, if they pull the subsidies away, will fall?
Yes. I believe the presumption ought to be in such a case that if a company can survive only by being subsidized, then it is probably not worth the cost of keeping it in business. Because if it were worth it, if the value of what it produced was at least equal to the value of all the resources that it uses to produce its product, then consumers would pay that price and those costs would be covered. And so if government has to subsidize the enterprise, then my presumption is that it's probably not worth the cost. You can, of course, tell stories that, the market fails. The market's failing to see these great benefits that will transpire in the future. It's possible. You can't deny that there's some benefit that the market is underestimating or some cost that the market is overestimating, for example. That's possible. But then why presume? My presumption, again, it's rebuttable. My presumption is that politicians and bureaucrats have no any better way to see the future than do entrepreneurs and people spending their own money. And so I'm sort of biased against people spending other people's money, because you're spending other people's money. You don't have much in the line yourself. When consumers choose to buy or not to buy a certain product, when entrepreneurs spending their own money or investors spending their own money choose to invest in this particular enterprise or that particular enterprise, they're putting their own money on the line. Of course, they often get it wrong, but I think the discipline of knowing that you are subject to a loss if you fail and that you will get a profit if you succeed, that discipline reduces the number of errors created in private decision making compared to the number of errors created when politicians and government bureaucrats direct resources. So as a general rule, yes, I think subsidies create and sustain inefficient industries, although I can't deny that in particular cases there are exceptions to that rule.
Yeah. Don, Donald Trump has introduced these protectionist policies. Is it fair to say they're protectionist policies? Tariffs.
Yes. Let me say there's one qualification. Donald Trump and his administration change, so they are so fickle today they're doing one thing, yesterday they were doing another thing, tomorrow they'll be doing yet a different thing. But while the degree of protection may rise or fall, it is unquestionably true that Donald Trump is an old-fashioned, dyed-in-the-wool, nothing creative about him protectionist. It is straightforward protectionism. I like to say, I mentioned Adam Smith again. If Adam Smith were resurrected today, of course the man died in 1790, but if he were resurrected today and he would spend a half an hour reading what the Trump administration says about trade, he would immediately recognize it for the arguments that he encountered 250 years earlier. And, of course, the names of the products and the countries would be different, but the arguments would be identical. He would not be surprised.
So one of the last cases where the US have come across a real life example of this rather than a theoretical hypothesis is the Smoot-Hawley tariff in 1930, where they introduced tariffs on US imports, and that actually worsened, whether we know this or not, worsened the Great Depression. Now, they're coming from a different baseline in terms of the economic growth levels were in decline due to the Depression, whereas at the moment you might have moderate incremental or just a plateau in terms of your changes to GDP today. So if you were in a recession now, it'll be a big no to these tariffs. And I'm just wondering, could Donald Trump's administration get away with these protectionist policies given the baseline you're at right now and not being able to, say, compare it to an event back in 1930 with the Smoot-Hawley tariff?
I think it depends on how severe the actual final degrees of protectionism are. We just don't know. Again, literally, it's true. Just a day or two ago, Trump said one thing about tariffs and Chinese imports, and then he changes yesterday about tariffs. So we don't know. So it depends upon the severity. It does depend on other things that happen in the economy, monetary policy, fiscal policy, what happened. I almost always criticize Trump. I do applaud some of the steps that his administration is taking on the regulation front. I think it's good to roll back some of these regulations that were imposed by the Obama administration and previous administrations. In fact, in my view, he's not rolling back enough of them. But, so it depends on how Trump's trade protectionist policies interact with his other policies. By the way, his anti-immigration stance, I think, is also bad for the American economy. And Smoot-Hawley was unquestionably a bad tariff. There's a myth that Smoot-Hawley played a large role in the Great Depression. It did not play a large role in the Great Depression. It didn't cause the Great Depression. I wish I could say it did, because I'm all about opposing tariffs. But it did not help, and it did worsen matters. And when we look at evidence of the effects of trade openness on economic growth, when we look at evidence of trade openness on levels of living standards, when we look at it across time in individual countries, when we look at it across different countries, we see overwhelming evidence that the freer is trade, the higher the rates of economic growth, and the higher are the levels of living standards. Now, it's true. At any one time, you always have other things going on in countries. Countries that tend to be more free trading also tend to be more free in other aspects of the economy. And you can say, well, it's the other things that cause the growth and not the free trade. But I think because we have good theory for believing that free trade promotes growth, the burden should be on those who oppose free trade to explain why, given that we have all these high correlations between freedom to trade and high economic growth, freedom to trade and high standards of living, what reason have you, I asked the protectionists, to say that restrictions on trade are really a contributor to economic growth? I think that's the burden they should bear, and I think it's a burden that they really cannot meet.
There's another aspect to that as well, which is a whole new other type of episode, is the other political benefits of free trade. So rather than having military intervention, it promotes diplomacy between countries, hence the European Union, so that we'd avoid another world war or wars between countries like France and Germany that have been going on for hundreds of years. And any article or news report that flashes up on over the last day or even today, they mention security.
Yes.
These policies, these tariffs that the US administration are imposing on the likes of Canada, the EU and Mexico are jeopardizing security. And I kind of thought, what's this about? Why security? Is this something that harks back to times whereby countries could have that? Obviously, they wouldn't do this military intervention, but are they playing hardball with the US by kind of stating these things? Or is that journalism?
I can't speak for what was said in the European press. In the United States, a lot of these tariffs are being sold to the public as a means of ensuring national security in the U.S. And I think it's just totally bogus. First of all, let's look at the steel and aluminum tariffs. The Trump administration said, well, we need these steel and aluminum tariffs for national security purposes. The U.S. Defense Department itself said, no, those are not necessary for our national security. But on a more general point, there is strong evidence that the more integrated nations are when they trade, the less likely they are to get into a shooting war with each other. It doesn't say it's impossible, but just 75 years ago, we in America were in a shooting war with the Japanese. The idea of going to war with the Japanese now is rather crazy. It's just as my friend Tom Palmer says, it's just a bad rule of business to shoot your customer, right? And so when you're getting important supplies from a foreign country, when foreigners are an important customer base for you, you're less likely to want to go to war with them. More importantly, the trade, you get to know each other better through trade. You become more like one another. If your two societies are completely separated, then it's easy to feel nothing but animosity because you're total strangers to each other. Trade is a way of making us, if not exactly alike, which people often criticize trade. Say, one of the things about trade is that it homogenizes the world. Well, maybe, I don't think it's actually true, but to the extent that it is true, there's a certain advantage to that. When you make people more alike, you make them less likely to want to kill each other and enslave each other and rape each other's women and steal each other's children. The idea of the United States going to war with the Canadians are among our biggest trading partners. We're not going to go to war with the Canadians. It's crazy. And I don't think we're going to go to war with the Chinese. And so when someone proposes, we need to restrict trade in order to promote national security, I know what they mean. Well, we need these important inputs to build our tanks and fighter jets. Maybe, but understand that one of the costs of those import restrictions is that because they make the nations a little bit less economically integrated than they would otherwise be, that effect works toward promoting a greater likelihood of military hostilities breaking out. And there is evidence, it's done by some economists here in the U.S., Solomon Polachek is one of the researchers who actually looked very carefully at data over many, many years. And they find strong evidence that more economic integration through trade does have a positive effect in reducing the likelihood of any two countries going to war with each other. And that is perhaps the single greatest benefit of trade, in my view. If it makes us less likely to kill each other, I think that's fabulous. And if on top of that we get more material enrichment, all the better. But not being as prone to want to shoot each other or bomb each other or mustard gas each other is a terrific benefit that's often overlooked.
Don, I'd love to be actually sitting into your classes. It's very interesting, and I'm having fun listening to that and absorbing everything that you're saying here. And I can't believe that an hour has passed already. Wow. And I wanted to talk about Hayek, and perhaps we could meet up again shortly and maybe have a discussion about Hayek, if that's cool with you.
I'm always happy to talk about Hayek. He's my great hero. So yeah, let's do it. Yeah.
Can I ask just a couple of questions, if you're okay? We could ask it next time if you want to, if you're busy to go elsewhere. Because I know it's 4:30 over there now.
Yeah.
This is probably a silly question because I know the answer already, but if you could step into the DeLorean and time travel, who would you like to go back to and meet? And what conversation would you like to? And I have to say him because I think I know it's going to be Adam Smith. Is it, or am I wrong?
Well, it's such a fun question, and there's so. I don't know if I have a single answer, but I'll give you, let's say three. When we say three people,
yes, round table, fantastic.
Right. Yeah. So Adam Smith is certainly on the list of three. Hayek, even though his life and mine overlap, we actually communicated by mail once. Very,
wow.
Yeah.
I thought you were going to say Ouija board for a minute.
Yeah, but another person, I don't know if you've heard of him, but he's another great hero of mine. He's he used to be well known in the U.S., was the old American, he was born in 1880 and died in 1956, was an American journalist named H.L. Mencken. No. And H.L. Mencken, he was the most famous journalist in the U.S. of his era. And he was such a wonderful writer, such a wise and witty, sage human being. He's one of my great heroes, and I just love the way he wrote. So though it was between Adam Smith, Hayek, and H.L. Mencken. And I don't know which one I would choose. It'd be a tough choice.
Yeah, it'd be a great conversation I'm sure you'll be having there at that table.
Yeah.
Knocking back shots of whiskey or something.
Yeah.
Or Jack Daniels. I think Jack Daniels is on the list for the EU to put tariffs on.
Well, it would hurt a lot of people in Trump country because it's made in a state that supported Trump.
I'd love to also know, do you have any kind of personal habits that you follow? I know this is kind of one of those questions, but a kind of a personal habit that you might have followed in your career, whether it comes to research or teaching. What's your most productive time?
So I have been, I'm not saying it's not a false, but I am lazy. I have a short attention span. I don't like being bored.
I'm the same as you.
Yeah. But I'm fortunate in that, I've always been a morning person. I get this from my mother. She's always awakened early and just genetically, I wake up early. And so one benefit of that is that it's kept me out of trouble that I would otherwise have gotten into late at night. And because I wake up early, I find the early morning to be a good time to work, because the distractions are fewer. The world's just a quieter place. And so I get a lot of work done in the morning. I generally think best in the morning. But I wish I had some sage advice to offer about work habits. It's just nothing you wouldn't think of. Just your reputation is the single most valuable asset you have. And so in my business, if I promise to write a paper for someone and get that paper to them by a certain date, just the fear of losing my good reputation makes me plow forward to doing that paper, even if, which happens a lot. I'll say, why did I agree to write this paper? I don't feel like writing this paper, but gosh darn it, I've already agreed to do it. So I have to do it now. But, other than just waking up early, getting a cup of black coffee and, not starting drinking until well after 5 o'clock, those are my recommendations.
I personally think, and I'm sure majority of people will think so as well, to have a deadline.
Oh, yes.
Is the one thing, like you were saying, like, why did I agree to that? But to have a deadline, because by not having a deadline, you just keep on passing it, the next day or the next week. Yeah. And before you'd know it, you look back and you think, like, I never got anything, I never wrote that book. Or, like, for example, I was reviewing a paper for a journal and they gave me something like 46 days to review it.
Yeah. I know what you're going to say. Yeah.
I agreed to it, because it was coming up to the Easter break and I had 2 weeks off during that Easter period. Yeah. When did I get it done? Yeah. The last 2 days.
So it's a very similar thing. I agreed, oh my gosh, 9 months ago, my colleague Dick Wagner's doing a book of chapters on Jim Buchanan. Yeah. And he asked me, he said, do you want to contribute a chapter? I said, oh yeah, sure. When does it due? He said, June 1st. Well, this was back in October, November. Oh yeah, I'll do that. Guess when I finished the paper? This morning.
Yeah.
I finished. Still
on time though.
Still on time. I have. In fact,
reputation.
In fact, it just occurs to me as soon as you and I get off of here, I actually have to send it to him.
Don't forget that anyway.
Yeah.
Like even I was looking at your book, Hypocrites and Half-Wits, A Daily Dose of Sanity from Cafe Hayek, and it's all these fantastic letters that you're writing to people.
Mostly newspapers and magazines. Yeah.
But like, if you had that in mind, that this is the product that you're going to produce at the end, you probably wouldn't have seen it. Like, this was a collection over time, hasn't it been?
Oh, yeah.
And it's the same with this podcast. Like, if I had a list of all the people that I'm going to be speaking to, I would be so overwhelmed I'd never get started.
Yeah. No,
so that's another thing. Just take a little bit by bit and let it accumulate.
That was a big, actually, long ago, that insight helped me to write. So when you think of writing, long papers, it's kind of intimidating. A 25-page paper. And then when you break it into sections, it's less intimidating. When you break the sections into subsections, it's less intimidating. The letters to the editor, I enjoy writing those because each one is just one or maybe two thoughts, compressed into, a maximum of 200 words. That itself is quite a discipline.
It is.
And I should mention one other habit that it took me a long time to appreciate, but I think I've mastered it. And that is it's almost Zen-like. I've lost my ego when I write. And so when people criticize my writing, I no longer take offense. Most of us are like, well, I meant this. And when I was able to ask other people what they thought of this thing that I wrote or that thing, and they gave me feedback, and I was able to lose all defensiveness about it, I think I became a better writer because you always know what you want to write.
You began to write for them, I bet you, did you?
What's that?
You probably started to write for them instead of starting to write for you, and it became there was a mental block then, a writer's block, and you had to step away from that and go back to your roots and write for you.
I think writing is always both for the writer and for the audience, but too often the audience is forgotten. I don't write a diary. The diary would be for me. But when I write a paper, when I write a letter to the editor, when I write an op-ed, while I get satisfaction out of it, and sometimes it often helps me actually clarify my thoughts, it's of no use or it's of very little use if all it does is help me clarify my thoughts. My ultimate goal, my bigger goal is to communicate a thought or two to a bunch of strangers. And it's not their responsibility to figure out what I'm trying to say. It's my responsibility to say what I want to say as clearly as possible so that other people can understand what I'm trying to say. And so realizing that it's my responsibility as a writer to persuade other people that I'm worth reading and that I have something important to say, rather than their responsibility as a reader to read what I write. Particularly in today's world, there's so much available to read.
Yes.
If you're not producing a good product, you don't deserve to have an audience. And
even though you said you have about 200 words per letter, is it 200 words you were saying approximately?
That's sometimes go longer, sometimes shorter, but that's kind of an average.
But there's still a lot of work in that. You have to edit and re-edit and just get it right so that your communication is spot on. There's no holes in there so people can misinterpret. So you have to be very clear on that. Don, I'd love to be able to share where people can actually find you. And it's at donaldjboudreaux.com.
Well,
also at Cafe Hayek.
That's not very active. So the best place I do all pretty much everything I write appears at my blog, Cafe Hayek. So just, CAFEHAYEK.com. I put stuff on Cafe Hayek every day, usually more than one thing every day. And, I try to make my stuff readable. And in a way, it's a labor of love, but I enjoy doing it. But that's where people can find me.
And I appreciate all this writing that's made available. And thank you very much for coming on the show and sharing your whole research area and your interest on international trade. And I'm very grateful again for the listener, Nathaniel Smith, for reaching out to me to get in touch with you. And it's a great link, and I really enjoyed the conversation. And again, if it's okay, if we could organise it very shortly to talk about Hayek, I'd love to, maybe next week, if that's good for you, or the week after. Yeah, we should be able to send me an email. We should be able to get something lined up. I'd love to do it. Yeah. Perfect. Great. Don, you are an economic rock star, and appreciate it, and thanks very much for your time. Thanks, I'm honored. Thank you. Bye-bye. All the best. See you then. Look. Bye. Bye. Economic Rockstar is a free podcast that does not exclude anyone from listening as long as they have a device to listen, download or stream. I have many listeners from all parts of the world, and I truly am pleased to know that the Economic Rockstar podcast unites all of you through the common theme of economics. I strive to commit to releasing an episode each week and aim to develop Economic Rockstar into much more than just a podcast. Patreon is a platform that gives you, the listener of the Economic Rockstar podcast, the opportunity to express your appreciation of the show by committing a financial reward for as little as $1 a month. Patreon allows me, the creator of the Economic Rockstar podcast, to be rewarded and paid by you so I can continue with the running costs of the show and to reinvest and expand the podcast into other platforms or mediums in the future. To find out more on how you can help the Economic Rockstar podcast and have your name added to the supporters list on my website, please check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/Economic Rockstar or visit the supporters page on the Economic Rockstar website. If you enjoyed this podcast, why not leave some feedback or comments on the show notes page on economicrockstar.com, where you can also sign up and be a member of the Economic Rockstar community. If you're listening to this episode on iTunes or Stitcher Radio, I would love to have some feedback and for you to leave an honest rating and review, as this will help with the rankings of the show so that more people can find it. If you're listening on the website economicrockstar.com, make sure you check out the back catalogue of all previous episodes and interviews with some amazing professors and authors at economicrockstar.com/podcasts. Thanks for listening, and I really appreciate your loyal support. I know how much you love audio, so why not get a free audiobook with Economic Rockstar today? I've teamed up with audiobooks.com to bring you this amazing offer. Visit audiobooks.com/rockstar to download your free audiobook now.